Hello, good evening, everyone. I don't have a glass to tap, so I'm just going to have to rely on you to stop talking. You're all very welcome to the Microsoft Executive Business Centre here in Brussels for the latest in our book talk series. It's an author series on topics shaping our world, and certainly if you're Irish, Brexit certainly counts. If you're European, it certainly counts, and I think if you're a citizen of the world, it affects you as well. So it's absolutely topical and correct that we're doing that. Um, I know when I talk to people back in Dublin about Brexit, it has the feel of a Netflix series that just they keep coming up. The scriptwriters keep coming up with new content, and it keeps rolling on and rolling on. And then, of course, what happens with a successful series? What do they do to squeeze the last bit of juice out of it? They come up with a Christmas special. And so now we're headed for a Christmas special on Brexit, thanks to events in London recently. So beyond the televisual quality of what we're watching, I think the forum here and the book talk series is a space where the big issues can be teased out and can be discussed, and where we bring people together to actually look at these big picture items. Because I know from my own experience working back in Dublin in politics and in government, we're facing huge challenges where we have essentially a 19th century political and democratic process dealing with 21st century challenges. The system has the legitimacy, but maybe not the bandwidth to respond to some of those challenges. Industry, on the other hand, tends to have the bandwidth, but not the legitimacy. And how do we find ways of developing hybrid models that deliver better public policy outcomes and solutions? These types of forums help contextualize some of those challenges, and certainly in terms of what we're dealing with in Brexit and our guests here tonight, I think we've got a stellar event. The book is Heroic Failure, Brexit and the Politics of Pain. I recommend it to anybody. Before I introduce the people on the stage beside me, I just thought I'd read out one paragraph that really spoke to me as somebody that worked in the Department of Enterprise back in Dublin for 5 years. It's about the final meeting before the signing of the Treaty of Rome back in 1955, where heads of state were dispatched to Messina to attend the meeting to sign off on the agreement. But the United Kingdom sent an undersecretary from the Department of Trade, his name brilliantly is Russell Bretherton. And when asked for his opinion and verdict on the treaty that was before them, he said, "The future treaty which you are discussing has no chance of being agreed. If it was agreed, it has no chance of being ratified. If it were ratified, it would have no chance of being applied. And if it was applied, it would be totally unacceptable to Britain. You speak of agriculture, which we don't like, of power over customs, which we take exception to, and institutions which frighten us. Monsieur le Président, Monsieur, au revoir et bonne chance." So I don't know if that's a forerunner of the 31st of January, but we're going to hear some more about that this evening. To my left is Laura Shields, a journalist who has worked with CNN, CNBC, Reuters, BBC, and now is the managing director of Red Thread Communications agency here in Brussels. One seat further over is a person who doesn't need any real introduction, other than to say Fintan O'Toole is one of those commentators, contributors, thinkers that the political system and the policy system need. We need a vibrant media, a vibrant series of inspections and criticism to make sure that we all have context. And I think what this book really describes and portrays is the context in which Brexit happened. Fintan O'Toole has a list of awards, prizes, medals, the length of my arm, but I think he will acknowledge that possibly his greatest acknowledgement and award is coming tomorrow evening when he flies to London to record Have I Got News for You? And if anything says you have arrived, it is getting onto the panel. By the way, don't tweet that. That's just between us. It's a secret between us all. But I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I hope you are too. Laura.
Thank you, Kieran, and good evening, everybody. I was going to say, if I go through Fintan's sort of list of achievements, we'll use up our full half hour of talking. So before we get into the substance of it, just so you know, Fintan and I will probably have a half an hour or so of conversation on stage, and then there will be plenty of time for you to ask questions afterwards. And it's a pretty full audience. I can see lots of English and British and Irish faces here, so that's sort of, as well as Europeans, so that gives you a fairly good indication of how pertinent this issue is. Huh? Yeah, I know, we're all Europeans still, continental Europeans. There you go, spot this exceptionalist Brit right from the word go. Okay, I can tell, right, so on that note, Fintan is a columnist for the Irish Times and has also been the recipient of the Orwell Prize and also the European Press Prize for his Brexit reporting. And we're going to get into the substance of the book now. I see there are two different titles there. There's The Delusions of Brexit and Heroic Failure, The Politics of Pain. And actually, it's the pain subtitle that I want to focus on to start off with, because I think we can all agree there is a lot of Brexit-related pain in circulation right now, not least for people, for Brits, reading the book, and seeing ourselves on the psychiatrist's couch, perhaps. But can you explain what pain you are referring to specifically when you talk about the politics of pain and Brexit?
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for coming, and thank you so much for doing this. When I started writing this book, it was just last summer, and I didn't think I was going to write a book about England, really. I thought I might write a book about Ireland and Brexit, because that's sort of where I live and where I come from. But the big question that just struck me that nobody was quite asking was, how does a privileged, prosperous Western European democracy begin to imagine itself to be intolerably oppressed? Because that really is the question we have to look at. And I know there are enormous and very important questions of politics and economics and class and austerity and all those kind of things feeding into it. But behind all of that, you have to have a credible proposition for a nation that is, in relative world terms, very privileged, to say that, you are feeling pain, you're feeling this terrible sense of being tyrannized and oppressed on a national level, right? So, if you said it to somebody in a deprived community in the north of England, you're oppressed and you're in pain, absolutely, of course, there's really fundamental reasons why people would feel that way, and good reasons. But this is at a national level, that the UK itself, and of course in particular England itself, has to feel this pain. And it's a sort of very strange kind of psychological process, isn't it? Because you then have to try to think about in what ways are you oppressed. And we might talk about this again when we talk about Boris Johnson. So, of course, one of the things, of course, is that the British press has spent 30 years giving people a sense of oppression, But it's a sense of oppression which is incredibly trivial, right? So most of it, as we know, is based on lies. Brussels is stopping our English hairy-chested fishermen from going out without wearing hairnets while they're catching fish. Or Brussels is banning donkey rides on beaches, or all that stuff, right? Which is very funny, and it kind of feeds into a sort of Monty Python-esque English sense of humor, I think, in one way. But the weird thing about it is that even if it were true, which in most cases it's not, so what? Even if it were true that donkey rides on beaches were being banned, it doesn't amount to Oliver Cromwell in Ireland. It's not quite the same thing. So being able to think yourself into this idea that you are really, really suffering, and you're suffering from a particular kind of national oppression, I think is the remarkable thing. And I think what I tried to argue in the book is that there are two very obvious, what I would call structures of feeling around this. So ways of creating emotion, and these are rooted, of course, in British post-war history. I mean, one is the unresolved business of the Second World War. Britain never got over winning the Second World War, which is, to be fair, I think it's true that Britain had a historical experience nobody else has ever had, right, which is that you win a really major conflict, I mean, arguably the major existential conflict of our times, and within 10 years, the very powers you defeated are doing better than you were, you know. So by the mid-1950s, you know, Britain has a huge balance of payments problem. It's you know, has very serious economic problems, and it's looking at the three Axis powers. I mean, Germany, Italy, and Japan are all undergoing these incredible economic miracles. So it's not unreasonable in a way to feel, actually, in a way, we didn't really win the war. We kind of lost the war. And so you get this reactionary narrative, which is built in from fairly early on. It's a fringe idea, but it comes into the center, as we've seen, which is that the European Union was created by the Germans as a way of reversing the result of the Second World War. And it trapped Britain into a kind of slavery. So you've that thing going on there. And then, of course, intertwined with it is the idea of the loss of empire, right, which has a very peculiar kind of psychological history too, I think, which is that I'm not suggesting that Brexit is just about nostalgia for empire. I think it's much more complicated than that. But I think the strain of thought that's going on there is that there's this sort of zombie stage of imperialism, which is when you've taken everything else from your colonies, and the one thing left is their pain, you know, their victimhood. So the imperial power, you know, can say, we suffer much more than anybody else. You know, we suffer more than any of the people who are our former colonial subjects. And I think the reason this feeds into Brexit is that what remains of the empire is just a mindset. And what you have in empire is a binary mindset. Right? In an imperial world, you are either the imperial power or you are subject. You know, you're either dominant or you're submissive, to use the great analytic tool that I draw on in the book, which is 50 Shades of Grey. So, you know, there are only those two states in empire. And what's missing is normal, you know, it's just normality. And particularly, of course, the normality, the tedious, ordinary normality of being one country among 28 doesn't figure somehow. It's a trick. And so these two things feed in together, I think, into this idea of a certain kind of specifically British pain, which is that we really lost the Second World War, and since we're obviously not dominating the European Union, it must be dominating us.
Mm-hmm. I mean, with hindsight, the sort of issues that you raise in the book, identity, emotion, empire, war, it seems blindingly obvious with hindsight that Brexit was always going to be the expression of a certain kind of English nationalist identity when we look at what's played out ever since. And yet in 2015 you had commentators such as Janan Ganesh in the Financial Times talking about how the Remain campaign would be won on the basis of cold, hard facts and cool heads, and that it would need to be a dull, boring, cynical campaign. And one of the things that you also reference in your book is that prior to 2016, apart from Anthony Barnett and Billy Bragg, so Anthony Barnett, who is the founder of the Open Democracy website, for those of you who don't know it, and Billy Bragg, who was, of course, a pop star and now a great political campaigner and lord, nobody really raised the issue of English nationalism as an emerging force. And, of course, this was completely misread by the commentariat, by the political class and the media class. Did you see it coming? And why did other people get it so wrong, given that now it just seems so simple and obvious?
Yeah. Instinctively, I always felt that if there was a referendum, Britain would vote to leave. But I wasn't quite sure why I felt that. So I'd like to be able to say that I fully foresaw all the factors that are going to play into it. I didn't. And in a way, it is remarkable, really, that this huge thing was happening And it was all there. So if you look at Britain is a very heavily surveyed society. You know, they're really excellent at rolling independent academic studies of questions like identity. There's a brilliant project which has been going since the late 90s called the Future of England study, which is very large scale. And what it was showing is really something quite remarkable, which I think was not politically recognized. It's understandable it wasn't politically recognized because we're used to thinking about nationalism in sort of classic 19th century terms. You know, nationalist movements have political parties, they have newspapers, they have national theatres, they have national poets. You know, you have W.B. Yeats. You know, you have a whole hinterland of the organisation of an emotion around national identity. And what's peculiar about English nationalism is that you don't have much of that, right? So even the obviously English nationalist party, UKIP, wouldn't call itself the English National Party. It calls itself the United Kingdom Independence Party. There's still no even vaguely respectable political party which says we are the English party. And yet, underneath this, if you look at the social surveys, it's a very rapid shift. So if you take 1997 as a base, most people in England ask the question about their identity, say British, and are quite comfortable with that. You know, by 2002, 2003, you're getting towards a majority of people in England saying English. And this is borne out in the 2011 census. In the 2011 census, 60% of people in England, given a choice, so it's a multiple choice, so you can tick more than one box, they tick English only as their identity. It's really quite remarkable. And in retrospect, of course, we can see where it's coming from. We can see that two big things happen at the end of the 20th century. The Belfast Agreement says that Northern Ireland is a sort of provisional part of the UK and can leave at any time. And the big thing maybe is the Scottish Parliament is set up in 1999. So within 2 years, you have these two other parts of the UK asserting themselves in different ways. And it's not surprising that you get English people saying, well, what about us? What's our national identity then? If you people don't want to be British anymore, if that big project, which after all is not that ancient, nation states project themselves as being kind of very deeply rooted and natural. It's nothing natural about the United Kingdom. It was formed in 1707, changed radically in 1801 when Ireland was brought into it, changed radically again in 1922 when most of Ireland left. So it's a malleable, open construct. And the English were just starting to say, actually, this doesn't represent us anymore. And nobody thought about that politically as to what the implications of that might be. Because what happened, of course, is they were never given, as you say, people like Anthony Barnett or Billy Bragg or a few small number of people were talking about it and saying, look, there's a positive thing here. This is not necessarily toxic. People want to have a political community. That's fine. What's the problem? The problem was that it wasn't being addressed or articulated, and then the only articulation it was given was Brexit.
And also, I think one of the things you reference in the book is that a lot of, sort of, how do you put it, the cultural elites in England would actually shy away from being English because a lot of the obvious symbols were things like lager louts, football hooliganism, and things like that. Yeah. I mean, the book, just to sort of take your audience through, it's a wide-ranging fest of, villains, but also, cultural tropes from England and the UK in general that are an absolute joy to read. To name some of them, you talk about punk, Scott of Antarctica, the Patrick Melrose novels, 50 Shades of Grey, not that that's British.
Well, she is English.
The Italian Job. I want you to talk about that as well, actually, later on, if you would. Shakespeare inventing Britishness in Henry V. It goes on. And, of course, prawn cocktail crisps and pseudo-populism. The whole thing is an absolute treat. I thought it was going to be very painful to read, but it wasn't. It was an absolute delight. All of this stuff is there. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Why does it take you? And yes, you say this, the evidence was there. Why weren't we seeing it?
It was easier for an Irish person to write it, I think, because maybe it's less painful for me being an outsider, but also because we're used to dealing with nationalistic angst, you know, like, you know, that's our shtick, you know, we've been doing it a long time. And so if you were writing in Ireland, you know, I mean, I'm 61, so, you know, I started writing the column in the Irish Times in 1988. The Troubles were still very, very much alive, and I've been writing elsewhere before that. So, you know, the Troubles is a big part of your professional and civic identity. You know, it's just there. You're very aware of the power of this stuff and also just how bad it can get. You know, remember, nobody in Belfast in 1968 thought we were in for 30 years of obscene violence, you know. And everybody else in Europe kind of knows this, right? So almost everybody else in Europe has been invaded, or they've had a fascist regime or a communist regime. You know, there's some memory of the fragility of a democratic society. And that's absolutely the case in Ireland, because we've experienced it so recently. So I think from an Irish point of view, you're sensitized to this kind of stuff. Also, I think you're allowed to get away with it in a certain sort of way. So I think I get to write things in the British press that my colleagues in Britain are not really allowed to write about.
Well, the Brexiteers hate you, so that's a fairly good indication that you are. But
but you know, let's go back to. I think there is an extraordinary complacency in the British establishment, for want of a better word. You know, that there's an assumption that the way we've done things for all these hundreds of years is great, and you know, this is just a temporary little.
Well, this brings me on to my next question. You know, what we call the dark fantasies, you know, so the dominant submission theme, and particularly in relation to Germany, that you talk about in the book. How did this play out, do you think? Or how does this explain then the sort of Brexiteer mindset towards how the EU was going to behave in the subsequent negotiations, particularly in relation to the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic? And also on this point about complacency, perhaps you could also reference our former Prime Minister, one David Cameron.
Yes. Well, let's just begin with Cameron, I suppose, in the sense that, I mean, remember, it's astonishing in retrospect that 48% of people voted to remain when the campaign was being led by David Cameron and George Osborne, you know, who had never, ever put forward the slightest bit of positive narrative about Britain's place in Europe. I mean, never. Remember that in 2014, facing into the long centenary of the First World War, Cameron issued instructions that the commemorations were not to be used to say that, you know, Europe had these two horrifically traumatic experiences and the European Union came out of it. That was not to be part of the narrative. That was not allowed. It was to be a British tragedy, which was understood to be understood in British terms. So, you know, I mean, Cameron's, I think, absolute failure to put forward any kind of a positive story. We know, because we do them a lot in Ireland. I mean, we have a written constitution which can only be changed by popular votes. So we've had popular votes pretty much every year. What we know is you win them by being positive. You know, actually, you win them by saying, look, this is the really good thing we can look forward to. You don't win them by saying, if you don't vote the way that we tell you to vote, you know, all hell is going to break loose. That never works. And Cameron could have lifted the phone and spoken to Enda Kenny, his Irish counterpart at that time. Said, what happens with referendums? How do they work? You know, and Enda could have told him quite a lot, actually, about how they can go wrong. So that complacency was there. Very simple thing. Brexit would never have happened. If Cameron had learned a lesson from the Scottish referendum, he thought he'd won it, which was, Scottish referendum was won in spite of Cameron, I think, rather than because of him. But the reason the Scottish National Party lost the votes in Scotland was because they were a responsible government. They said, we are suggesting a huge change in the entire constitutional structure of Britain and of our own country. We're going to publish a document that says, what does it mean? If you read the Scottish National Party's or the Scottish government's proposal, it's 960 pages, I think, right? Which meant that the entire campaign then was about, well, hold on, what you say about the currency on page 643 doesn't make much sense. You know, it was a very specific campaign about specific proposals. And Cameron's absolute refusal to take this thing seriously and say, we're going to have a referendum in 2 years' time, there will be two campaigns, they will each publish a long white paper on what does it mean to stay and what does it mean to leave. Leave would never have been able to do what it did, which was say anything. So that's part of it. But I suppose the other question about how this played out in terms of the negotiations, I think, is interesting.
Specifically about Germany coming to the rescue and how that meant that they catastrophically misunderstood the situation.
So, I read a lot in the book about these sort of fantasies of German domination. And you might think, okay, well, that's very abstract. It's kind of just over there, isn't it? But it's literally the case that it shaped the negotiating strategy for Brexit, right? So David Davis, who was the first Brexit secretary, I mean, you probably all remember seeing that extraordinary photograph of the opening day of negotiations, with Barnier and Vaillant on one side of the table with, masses of paper and documents and stuff, serious things, and David Davis kind of sitting there like, hello, nice to see you, why is he doing that? Well, he's doing that because, and Davis was quite explicit about this, these are not the real negotiations. Why are they not the real negotiations? Because the European Union is not real. It's just a front for Germany, basically. And so therefore the real negotiations will happen in Berlin. And Davis said this, this will be settled over
and also, actually, Cameron was upset about Merkel on a couple of things. Yeah, sorry.
So it's all, this is us and the Germans. And then there's this kind of paradoxical sense of it, right? One is, well, us and the Germans, we always win. And therefore, it's a battle of nerve. Why do we win? We win because we've got more pluck. Really, this is what it comes down to. And you kept hearing over the last 3 years, this will be settled at the last minute. Why the last minute? Because that's when character comes into play, and holding your nerve comes into play. And if we just keep going, if we just don't take this terribly seriously, they'll get frightened, and then it'll all be settled. So it actually shapes, well, calling it a strategy is probably a little bit of a compliment to it, but it shapes the mentality that's brought to bear on all of this. And of course, it leads to a complete misreading of the European Union, how it works, and how it's going to react in all of this. Particularly, of course, in relation to Ireland, which is the idea that, Merkel will just dump the Irish when the time comes because, after all, they want to sell their BMWs. Just a very brief thing. One of the weird things about this is it's the last Marxist analysis that we've had in Western Europe as a serious kind of proposition. Because remember, well, very crude kind of Marxism. Because the whole proposition was the German car manufacturers will determine what happens with Brexit. They want to sell their cars, ergo, when the time comes, they will tell Merkel, they'll instruct Merkel to instruct the European Union to give Britain cake and let it eat cake. Yes, so.
Boris Johnson gets a special place in the book, and also for the audience here, probably for some of our perhaps older members of the audience may well remember when Boris Johnson was actually a correspondent here. I'd like you to reflect a little bit on his role, but also this is the man who's, aspired to be the next Churchill in all of this. And you quite explicitly say in the book that if Boris Johnson, in his attempts to do this, this means Brexit is doomed to fail. So perhaps you could explain exactly what you mean by that, given that at the moment, against all odds, he has a deal that nobody ever thought he was going to be able to get.
Yes. Well, I suppose I would still say it's doomed to fail in its own terms. I mean, remember, what people were offered was all the advantages of being in the European Union without being a member. So that remains doomed to fail. And I mean, Johnson's role in all of this is absolutely central, isn't it? Because he, as you know, as Brussels correspondent of the Telegraph, he became the person who's kind of set the agenda for most of British journalism in relation to the European Union. He did it, and I know my colleague from the Irish Times is here, Paddy, and maybe other people who work in the media in Brussels. It's a really difficult job because it's really important and really boring, and it's a very prestigious job in journalism to be the Brussels correspondent for a major newspaper, but you're on page 14, and so Johnson's just thinking when he comes here, like, how do I get onto page 1? He's a really ambitious figure. Now remember, Max Hastings, who's the person who hired him, has distanced himself from Johnson a lot. But they knew he was a liar. I mean, he was hired because he had been fired from his first trainee job on the London Times for making stuff up. I mean, why do you then hire this guy, give him a much larger salary and send him to Brussels? Because making stuff up is fun. And Johnson is the perfect character for this in a way, because he could do this thing of everything is serious and nothing is serious. You know, it's all in quotation marks. It's all, I used the word camp. You know, it's very camp. The whole performance is, you know, nothing is to be taken on its own terms. And it does, you know, what Johnson feeds into is the British sense of humor, you know, which is a very sort of deflationary kind of humor. You take grandiose things and you cut them down to size. You mentioned the prawn cocktail flavoured crisp. Just to remind you, Johnson's first big campaign as a heroic patriot was to preserve the prawn cocktail flavoured crisp. Remarkably, I'd actually forgotten, it's in the book, but I'd actually forgotten it when he said that he would die in a ditch rather than seek an extension on October 31st. He had previously said he would die in a ditch to save the prawn cocktail flavoured crisp. And, you know, there's something in that, you know, these two things operate on exactly the same level of camp humor, you know, of everything being sort of so grossly exaggerated that it doesn't matter whether it's real or not anymore. And I think Johnson, I mean, you have to remember that Johnson, I mean, it's a real irony. Johnson could go down as the person who delivered Brexit. He's the person who cares least about it. Like he has absolutely no investment in it. I mean, Johnson was asked a few years ago, had he any convictions, and he said he had one for speeding. You know, and that applies to the EU as well. Like, he just doesn't care about, you know, the business. He's fed up with the whole thing, just banging on about Europe. He used to, I wish they'd all stop banging on about Europe, you know, even while kind of feeding all of this kind of clownish stuff into the system. And it becomes one of the things that's almost impossible to deal with then, which is that it's catastrophic and it has enormous consequences for people, but it's also a game that's being played all the time. And so my view was that Johnson would not be able to manage the transition from the sort of clownish thing into seriously getting a deal. It remains to be seen, by the way. You know, I don't think it's a given that he's going to win the election and get this through.
But if he does win the election and gets it through, is the pain going to be felt in his tenure, or is it going to be front-loaded further down the line like a slow puncture? Well,
yeah, the slow puncture is a good metaphor. I mean, obviously they've got the transition period, although that could be quite short. I think there are two really, really fundamental contradictions that are going to have to be dealt with. And if Johnson is the Prime Minister, he's the one who's going to have to deal with them. And I don't believe he has the political or intellectual dexterity to do so. One of these is that for the vast bulk of Brexit voters, it's a nationalistic project about trying to restate. I mean, the brilliance of the slogan, "Take back control," it was about, you know, bringing power back to communities that feel they've lost it. But for the people at the top who are really driving the project, it's an ultra-globalist project, of course. It's about stripping away even the minimum standards that the European Union has and opening Britain up to all this global Britain, you know, which is really very much about opening it up to completing the Thatcher project, as many of the people leading it would see it. That's a fundamental contradiction, you know. I mean, if he starts trying to do a trade deal with Trump and the first item on the Trump agenda is, and this is, we know this, is the National Health Service in Britain is very effective at negotiating, because it negotiates as a single country with the American pharmaceutical companies and gets drugs much, much cheaper than they are in America, for example. One of the first things on Trump's agenda is, you know, our pharmaceutical companies want to charge, you know, 3-4 times what they currently charge, breaks the NHS. How does that work politically? It doesn't. And the other thing that doesn't work politically, briefly, is the union, of course, right? So we've seen interesting movements on Johnson's part in this, but all the rhetoric has been the precious, precious union. We stand by the union comes first, Remember, Johnson, like one of those kind of tin pot dictators, as soon as he became prime minister, awarded himself a new title that nobody ever heard of, which was Minister for the Union. You know, so it's all that kind of unionist rhetoric, and yet we know that Brexit breaks the union. So you've got those two really fundamental contradictions, which are going to play out on Johnson's watch if he is re-elected. And I don't think he has the dexterity to handle them.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a round of questions from the audience now. So if you'd like to ask one, please wait for the microphone, and then when it comes, Aoife, thank you. Just tell us who you are. Okay, so we'll take one here. We'll take Aoife at the front, and then lady over there had her hand up as well, and we'll take a third gentleman here. So Aoife.
Well, there's been another journey that's happened, another union that's now discussed, which is a united Ireland. And what journey do you think has happened in Ireland? And I was very surprised the first time I read a story in the Irish Times talking about a united Ireland. I mean, the Irish Times has rarely been the most nationalist of papers. How have things changed in the last few years?
Okay. We'll take the two more first. So lady over there.
Yes, my name's Hannah. I'm from the Centre for European Progression, and I see myself as a Scot and a Brit and a European in equal measure. And what interests me is, why haven't we fallen for this in the same way that perhaps the English have? Because we'd like to think we didn't participate in empire, but Glasgow made so much kind of money off of that. We like to convince ourselves that we are very, very different. Is it purely a reaction to the surge of Englishness that we are acting ourselves as different? That was my first thought when I kind of heard about that. So
Thank you.
Good question.
And then gentleman here, just if you could wait for the microphone, thank you.
If Graham Meadows, if one of the people who let the side down were the Germans because they didn't do what they were expected to do, what about Dublin?
Yes.
Dublin played a blinder.
Great questions.
Okay, so the question about United Ireland sort of reappearing as an idea, Scottish identity, and also Dublin.
Yes. Maybe just start with the Dublin question because it might lead us on to the United Ireland one. So a huge part of the miscalculation, I mean, believe it or not, there was a fairly substantial body of opinion within the Brexit world that just thought, well, Ireland has to leave. They joined with us in 1973, and obviously they will leave with us. So all this nonsense about the border doesn't really arise. We're all going to be outside the European Union. And maybe they'll kind of come back into the fold a bit more because we're building this, new Empire 2.0, the White Empire, with Australia, Canada, New Zealand. So Ireland can fit in with that. It'll all be fine, won't it? I mean, it was a serious kind of thought there. And that was part of the miscalculation. Another part of the miscalculation, of course, was that the questions, if they did arise between Ireland and Britain, could be dealt with bilaterally. Right? So the idea was basically, we can sort this out. We can get the Irish in a room. We're the big boys, and they're the little boys, and they'll essentially go along with whatever we need to do. Not understanding the very simple fact, and it is disorientating for everybody, right? So for 800 years of Anglo-Irish relations, there's been a senior partner and a junior partner, and we know which of those Ireland is. This time, over the last 3 years, Ireland has been in a more powerful position than Britain. Not because Ireland suddenly become big, it's simply because it's part of the 27. And it diplomatically, as you say, did an extraordinary job of making sure that its interests were perfectly aligned with the 27. So therefore, the British didn't know how to deal with this. I mean, it's really difficult to deal with the fact if you're used to a very profoundly settled notion that Ireland is weaker than you and will ultimately have to do what you want, then I think you just get that wrong. This brings us on to United Ireland and this great question, I think. Look, a United Ireland has always been a kind of movie playing in the heads of Irish people of different persuasions, right? Either something to be dreaded by Ulster Protestants or something to be aspired to by most of the rest of the island. This is not that movie. And I think this is why, again, Brexit is so disorientating, right? So the notion in the Belfast Agreement was that there would come a point, maybe just demographically, through demographic change, that you would get a majority of people in Northern Ireland who would want a United Ireland. There would be a border poll, and everybody would vote, and you'd have United Ireland. That was supposed to be the way it would happen. I think most people thought of this as at least a generational process, right? And reconciliation would have to come first, right? There's no point in doing it if you're simply replacing a disaffected Catholic minority in Northern Ireland, which was at the core of the Troubles, with a disaffected Protestant minority on the island as a whole, right? So it was supposed to be a long-term process that would evolve in that way. The problem with Brexit is, of course, that there's another nationalism. It's coming from a completely different direction. What's now driving United Ireland is English nationalism, right? It's the potential for this sort of English self-assertion to break up the union. And if there's no union, what do you have to be a unionist about? It really makes it fundamentally difficult. We've seen an extraordinary thing in the last couple of weeks. I mean, I don't think because it's all part of the Brexit drama, it's really been thought through fully, but Boris Johnson's betrayal of the DUP is really dramatic, and it's a bell that can't be unrung. I mean, even if Johnson loses the election, even if Brexit never happens, a British government has now said, actually, it's fine for you to be on a completely different track from Britain. It's fine to put up, essentially a border in the Irish Sea. It's an astonishing thing for any country to say. And that does hasten this idea of a United Ireland. Nobody's ready for it. It hasn't been thought through. It hasn't been prepared for. And it's actually not something to look forward to in the next 5 years. But it's quite possible that if you get Scottish independence, we're pushed towards it. And that brings us to the Scottish question. I think the reason Scotland is different, I think, yes, partly as an Irish person, that we'll always do whatever the English are doing, the opposite must be us. Samuel Beckett supposedly, I don't know if he ever actually said it, but he was supposedly asked in Paris, "Vous êtes anglais, Monsieur Beckett?" He said, "Au contraire." And so that's kind of, I think the Scots are similar enough. But you know more than I do, but I would have thought the underlying reason is that Scotland, whatever you think about Scottish nationalism, has evolved a complex, sophisticated, open civic nationalism, which is well articulated. It's there as a presence and understands itself in European terms. Whereas English nationalism is the opposite of all of those things, right? So it doesn't have anything like that kind of sophistication or complexity. And I think Scottish nationalism is very interesting if you look at the last referendum. By the way, they always talk about you can't have a second referendum on Europe. The 2016 referendum was the second referendum. I mean, they had a referendum in 1975, which was won for Remain by 2-1. Very interestingly, in 75, the areas that voted most heavily to leave the European Union were Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The very places that actually voted quite heavily to stay. Wales is a bit more complicated. Why? Because they all began to understand, which they didn't understand in 75, that this is not a homogenization of identity. Actually, for small cultures and small nations, being within the European family is a very good way of sustaining your sense of distinction, because it's a realistic way of being small.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll take another round of questions. There's one there, gentleman at the back, and Darren. And Alice here, please. So yeah, Alice, if you could ask yours first.
Hi, my name is Alice Stolmeyer from Defending Democracy. I was wondering if you think there are many parallels with the United States. Like, could you write a similar book about America first and the politics of pain?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman there.
Hugh Barton-Smith from SEPS. Mr. O'Toole, to my shame, I don't think I actually knew who you were until about 10 years ago, which was a period when...
Even my family didn't know who I was 10 years ago.
Oh, well, there you go.
Fine.
But it was a time when everybody in Ireland was railing against the tyranny and oppression of the ECB.
Yeah.
Now,
including me. Yeah.
Well, I thought I'd remembered correctly. Now, the thing is that you talk about the myths of Germans coming to the rescue of UK, whereas in fact the Irish taxpayer is still coming to the rescue and will be for decades hence of German banks who unwisely invested in Irish real estate.
Yes.
Now, the thing is, we don't hear about that anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering has Brexit helped Ireland get past all of that resentment?
Okay, thank you. And Darren.
Thank you. Darren McCaffrey from Euronews. Fintan, you talked an awful lot about English nationalism. One person you couldn't describe, I think, as an English nationalist is Jeremy Corbyn. And I would make an argument that actually you forget about the figures of David Cameron, Theresa May, Jean-Claude Juncker, Michel Barnier, Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, that actually at every stage of the last process of the last 4 or 5 years, Jeremy Corbyn has been more instrumental almost than all of them. He was someone who didn't campaign during the referendum, is instinctively Eurosceptic. What do you think about the role of the left, essentially, in Brexit, the role of the unions, and how much has that played, given the fact that it doesn't seem to fit into the narrative of English nationalism?
Thank you. Okay, so parallels with US, getting over the, financial meltdown, and then also, the role of the left in the unions.
So just on the, you said it so brilliantly that I don't really have to say it again. I think you're absolutely right about it. It's a funny business. I mean, I still feel really strongly about what happens in Ireland. The fact that Ireland had to bear a vastly disproportionate brunt of the European banking crisis, and linking the so-called bailout program to the rescuing, not even the rescuing, it wasn't even the rescuing of banks, it was putting money into completely dead banks. Talking about zombie imperialism, we had zombie banks, and we put vast amounts of public resources into them. But I think you're absolutely right that in a way Brexit has sort of sobered people up about saying, however bad it is, the alternative is much worse. And I think that maybe has happened in a lot of the rest of Europe too, which is there are very good reasons to worry about the Euro project, the European Central Bank, about the the European Union, democratic deficit, all the rest of it. But the Brits have given us an example of how not to respond to that. And I think that's a really good point. In terms of parallels with Trump, I think they're very strong, aren't they? I mean, they're so to do with this idea of pain, which is a displacement of pain, isn't it? So it's not the people who actually have good reason to feel oppressed and that they are suffering. It's the people who feel that they are in danger of losing a status of privilege, who are capable of being mobilized in this way, right? So let's talk about it. It's mostly men, and it's mostly white men, and those two things are historically enormous privileges, and the undermining of those privileges has led to a sort of judo move, right, where the right has been able to appropriate what was the language of the left, right, which was the language of victimhood, the language of suffering, the language of oppression. And so you get this kind of competitive victimhood. And I think this definitely feeds into Brexit in the way that I've been talking about, this sense of being intolerably oppressed by the European Union. But it also, of course, is at the heart of the whole Trump project, which is making people who are, in many cases, not in all of them, but in many cases, relatively privileged. I mean, there's a myth that the very poor in America all voted for Trump. I mean, they didn't.
Well, a lot of them did. The opioid, and
yes, but the white poor did, but the black poor, the Hispanic poor, by and large, didn't. So it's not necessarily about poverty. It's about that sort of mixture of a loss of economic status with a loss of gender status and a loss of ethnic status. So all of those kind of things are definitely there.
I'm glad, and then there was the final question on unions and the left.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. You're absolutely right. Of course, it's a huge issue here, and we should remember that again, there's been something of a reversal, not entirely so, but I mean, the most anti-European party is historically in Britain was the Labour Party, and it was very much tied into a classic sort of socialist view of the European project as a sort of ultra-capitalist project from which the British working class needed to be protected. This also fed into, there's a very long history of English radicalism, right, which is a sort of anti-Catholic, anti-European, anti-continental idea that English liberty is exceptional. Over there on the continent, particularly in France, they're slavish. They're more oppressed than we are. And the left has sort of always had that kind of rhetoric of a particular kind of English liberty, which is distinctive. And I think with Corbyn, you got a bit of a revival of that, right? Which is socialism in one country. You know, going back to that idea that you could create a very radically social democratic stroke socialist new settlement, but only if you were able to break the shackles of being tied to Europe. I think it's fundamentally mistaken. I think it mistakes what is overwhelmingly a reactionary project for one that has sort of progressive potential. The unions, I just don't understand how a Labour Party could stand up to the Nissan workers in Sunderland, for example, and say, this is all okay, that your jobs are going to be gone. Or to the workers in Airbus in Wales, you know, and say, you know, your entire system, your job, your community is fundamentally dependent on membership of the European Union. But we're not going to say that because that might offend you somehow.
Well, the unions are split.
The unions are very
like
split.
the country.
Absolutely
I
split.
mean, it's complicated, unfortunately.
It is, yeah.
Just before we move on to the next round of questions, for those of you who haven't read the book, I'm glad Fintan brought in the point about it largely being men, because in the book, apart from Margaret Thatcher, Barbara Castle, and the fictional woman in the European Commission that Boris Johnson makes up to be the severe nanny who's going to not allow him any prawn crisps, there are no women. So it's just, you know, it's quite striking how male the book is and how Brexit and identity are. Okay, another round of questions, please. We've got time for about maybe 2 more rounds if they're quick. Oh, and we still have lots. Gentleman there, lady there, and lady at the back. And I can see you, Sharon. I'll come to you next round, I promise. If you could keep them, we'll keep these ones tight because we'll try and get one more round in. We need to finish at 7. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll keep my question brief. You sort of touched on it at the beginning, and we nibbled around the edges just now. You said Britain is profoundly a highly developed, wealthy society. But what I haven't heard, what at least to me is sort of had a profound impact, was the impact of the Cameron-Osborne austerity program. Because by the time of the referendum rolled around, it certainly, for those living in it, was not a wealthy society for the most. It was not a prosperous society. And I think you can also argue it was not a democratic society, if not least due to the vagaries of first past the post.
Yeah. Yes.
And that, I don't think you could explain all of it. I do think a lot of it is tied up to identity. But I think you wouldn't have had a majority in the referendum without 8 years of essentially destroying society.
Absolutely. Okay, so austerity, lady there, I think.
Thank you, Vita Slieda from Latvian Permanent Representation. January 31st, 2020, let's presume we have 3 scenarios. We have agreement ratified, we have possible no deal, or we have another extension. On which scenario would you put all your savings and why?
Now's the time, Fintan, to make that prediction. Okay, crystal ball time. And then there was a lady at the back as well.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. It was
Thank
brilliant,
you.
in my opinion. I wanted to ask you, do you think that Brexit could be an example of identity politics, the thing that happened in the US?
Yes.
And that's the European expression of it.
Yes.
Okay, so austerity. I cannot read the second thing.
Crystal ball.
Yeah, crystal ball. Identity politics. It's fine to say yes, yes,
okay,
yes.
so briefly, yes. No, you're absolutely right. And I think one of my reluctances in terms of I'm talking about identity, I'm talking about all these kind of psychological aspects of it. But you're absolutely right. They're very important to understand how it happens. They're not that important to understand why it happens. And you're absolutely right. It happened because very large numbers of people are deeply displaced and are suffering really very badly from a sense of not having any control over their own communities and their own lives anymore. Put it simply, I do say this in the book, that a critical thing to understand is why was Britain able somehow to cope with all of these syndromes, psychological syndromes, in the 1950s and 1960s, bad as they were, because of the welfare state. They were able to cope because the welfare state was a huge dike erected against self-pity, because it gave people reason to think, actually, you know what, life is getting better. It doesn't matter if the empire's gone. My life's better. It doesn't matter, you know, what we didn't get what we deserved out of the Second World War. It doesn't matter. My kid can go to university. Nobody in my family ever went to university before. Those kinds of things about the future are what keep at bay these sort of toxic distortions of the past. The question about if I had to put my money...
Are we going to be here in 10 years having the same conversation?
You know, I'm going to be proved very wrong. I know it's being live streamed, means it's probably going to be on the internet and I'm going to be mocked for it. But I've been saying since the start that I still think it will end up with a second referendum. And maybe this looks much, much less likely now, but I don't think it's hugely unlikely that there'll be another hung parliament out of the election. And if there's another hung parliament, I mean, what did they do? You know, like and I've also been saying from the start that it's a real pity that the smartest English person is dead and fictional, which is Sherlock Holmes, you know. But I mean, Holmes is asked by Dr. Watson, how do you solve a particularly difficult crime? And he says, you eliminate the impossible, and whatever remains, however improbable, must be the solution. You know? And the impossible has always been deal or no deal in a way. Any deal they get is innately worse than their status quo. You know? It's always going to be worse. And they can't do no deal. I don't think they're ever going to do it. So I think there's still a good chance that, so if you absolutely force me to put my children out on the street and put my house on it, that's probably where I would go. And in terms of identity politics, yes, absolutely, you know, a large part of this is about identity politics. But it's about, as well as, you know, this kind of victimhood, competitive victimhood coming into play. It's a strange one because, and this is what gives me some kind of hope, it's an identity politics which will not address the identity questions at its heart. English nationalism is not going to be solved by leaving the European Union. It just leaves them with themselves. It leaves them with you know, the Europeans have been complaining throughout all this process that the English have been negotiating with themselves. The British have been and actually that's true and will remain true. The real negotiation here is internal, and none of it's solved by Brexit. The likelihood is it'll be made worse by Brexit.
The gods of time have given us 10 more minutes to fix this all. So what is your remedy for managing English nationalism going forward, bearing in mind, as you say, that it doesn't have to be a dirty word. It can actually be a positive thing.
Look, I mean, Englishness is one of the great cultures of the world. You know, it has within it extraordinary resources of imagination, of science, of art, of political radicalism and progressivism. You know, there's a vast amount to be very proud about being English. The National Health Service that was constructed after the Second World War is one of the most civilized institutions in human history. You know, and to actually be able to say to everybody, you know, you will enjoy the dignity of not having to be terrified of getting sick is an extraordinary human achievement to have managed. I do have a preface to the book in which it's slightly autobiographical, in which I talk about my own relationship to England, you know, but most of my aunts and uncles, my father's people and some of my mother's, left Ireland in the 1950s to go to England. Why did they go to England? I don't think they went to England. I said they emigrated to social democracy. You know? I mean, you know, the kind of lives, the kind of opportunities they, and in particular their kids, could have in England were remarkable. It's not rocket science to say that, you know, I think there's actually a very large English consensus around basic social democratic values. And the restoration of those values seems to me to be absolutely critical. It has to go hand in hand with radical democratic reform. So you can't keep saying we are the mother of parliaments. Mm-hmm. We are, you know, the envy of the world in terms of our democracy when you look at what's been going on in the last couple of years. And I don't mean that as an anti-English statement, but, you know, for God's sake.
No, but we need proportional representation.
You know,
and things
we
like
don't
that.
have a written constitution because we know that, well, it'll always be, you know, good chaps will be running the state. The shock, you know, Jonathan Sumption, whom I really admire enormously, just a Supreme Court judge who just retired, one of the great legal thinkers in England, said, you know, that the problem with the prorogation thing was that you suddenly had a bounder in office, you know. And, you know, the rest of us all over Europe would say, yeah, but your constitution is there to stop the bounders. You know, it's not there to enable the good people. That's all fine. You know, a constitution if you were German or you were Belgian or you were Dutch or you were French or you were Irish, you think, a conscious there to think because, oh, a lot of stuff can go wrong. You know, maybe the default state is a kind of chaos and we have to construct legal and political institutions to stop it. The English have to get their heads around that. They still think that, you know, fundamentally nothing fundamental is going to go wrong. If you listen to people, you talk to people, they keep saying, yeah, Brexit will be hard for a year, but then it'll all be fine. You know, we're English after all. And they have to really get their heads around radical democratic reform.
So written constitution, possible proportional representation. Just quickly before I go back to the audience, do you think English Parliament?
Well, yes, I mean, absolutely some form of English representation. Absolutely.
Okay, great. I'll take another round of questions. I know, Sharon, you wanted to ask one. Anyone else? Yes, lady there. And gentleman there in the second row. So Sharon, yeah.
You said that, I'm sorry, Sharon Clare-Spooner, I'm chair of Pro Europa. You said that in Ireland, the referendums have been won by a positive campaign.
Yes.
I think that's just something for all of us here in the room to reflect on, because positive things about Europe in England are not very, very widespread. And we're going to be up against the propaganda machinery is going to go into overdrive. So apart from recommending that they read Irish press rather than British press, how are we going to deal with that propaganda machine and an appeal to everyone in this room to think about what you can do as an individual to help rectify that gap?
Thank you. And then there was a lady there.
Hi. I was interested in whether I suppose I should read it. Does your book go into what an enormous waste of time this is when we have rather bigger concerns?
Yes.
Like the Brexit discussion takes up a lot of time in the council meetings here that could be being used to respond to the climate and environmental crisis, which I know you're interested in as well. But this, for me, and I'm Northern Irish, is one of the biggest Brexit failures that there is. It's just so much time not being devoted to proper problems.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And then gentleman in the second row.
Yeah. So British nationalism, let's put it British nationalism versus federalism. Not European federalism, but I mean federalism.
Yes.
Even including British, and Britishness is a kind of confederal perception of a polity. And second question about non-British communities being in favor of Brexit.
Yes.
Just a comment.
Sure.
Thank you.
You clear on all of them?
No, you might just...
Okay, so there's how to deal with the propaganda machine in the
Yes.
I'm assuming, I think Sharon means in the context of a referendum, but actually you could equally apply it to the general election.
Yeah.
And then colossal waste of time, and nationalism versus federalism, and the fact that not I think all EU countries are anti-Brexit. Was that the point? Or nationalism versus federalism?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Well, so in terms of the propaganda machine, you know, we know it's going to be there, and we know what the slogan is, right? So what would be the equivalent of take back control? What will the slogan be? It will be tell them again. Very powerful slogan, you know. They didn't listen to you. You had your voice, and you were not listened to. It's a very powerful message to put across. And of course, it's at the heart of the election campaign as well. You know, people versus Parliament, all that stuff. And we know that narrative again, Trump, you know, has pioneered it in some ways. The elites, even though the people themselves who are driving this are very much elitists. So we know that's going to be there. What counters that cannot be you were stupid, you did the wrong thing. You know, own up and go back and do the right thing. Right, so it has to be remain and reform. It has to be remain and transform. It has to be saying, you know, we know that this came out. It is a cry of pain. Let's address the pain. You know, let's actually deal with why are people so angry? Why do they feel so displaced? Why do they feel so voiceless? So I think you know, if it's just about saying let's forget the whole thing, you know, there've been a couple of soap operas where they run into big trouble and they want to just end it, or they want to start a whole new storyline, and somebody wakes up and says, the whole last season was just a bad dream. I had a most strange dream. It can't be that. Like, it really has to address what the driving forces were. Some of those you can't address. Some of them are to do with xenophobia and anti-immigration sentiments. I mean, some of that you can try to address, but let's be honest. There's a core of people who are not reachable in those terms. But I think a lot of people are reachable, and I think it depends on how they're addressed. What we know from doing referendum campaigns is three things work. One, as I said, is positivity. This is going to be better if you vote in this way. The second one is personal stories. What does this mean to me? Actually, people are interested in other people and how things affect them. And the third thing that works is local. You have to make it local. You have to bring it down into people's communities. Those are the great weapons, I think, for civic debate. It's still possible, I think, to have civic debate in our society. On the thing about federalism, nationalism, and non-British communities in Britain, the UK should have moved to a properly federal structure, in my view, 20 years ago, right? So they did sort of timid reform in the late 1990s, where you got the devolution settlements. They really should have, I think at that stage, if you'd said, let's have a federal structure whereby you have these four nations and you take it seriously and you make it a whole reform where you also use that to get rid of an unelected House of Lords, you use it to get, to change the electoral system, all sorts of other stuff going on. I think it could have been done then and should have been done then. After all, in the Home Rule crisis, the Irish Home Rule crisis in the early 20th century, a lot of people were already saying then the way to solve the Irish problem is Home Rule all round. Let's have an English Parliament, let's have a Scottish Parliament, an Irish Parliament, and a Welsh Parliament. Lloyd George, who was the British Prime Minister during the First World War, was a Welsh Home Ruler. So it wasn't a mad idea. It was kind of pretty much accepted by a lot of people. And I think maybe they might end up there, but I'm afraid it might be too late. I think they may be heading towards the breakup of the Union itself. So you won't have a kind of federal solution. Just on the point about black and ethnic communities in Britain who voted for Brexit. One interesting thing, by the way, is that the polls show very clearly that the biggest change group, so the biggest group of people who voted to leave, who are now saying they would vote Remain, are those communities, right? So they've changed their minds on it. One of the reasons why they voted for Brexit is because a lot of them, particularly the Asian communities, were told that if we vote for Brexit, if we leave the European Union, we won't have all of this migration from the European Union. Therefore, we will have a lot more migration from India and from Pakistan and from the old Asian Commonwealth. One of the stories, again, the Leavers were very, very clever about doing exactly what I'm talking about, a particular personal kind of story, the curry chef story, right? So
that's Priti Patel.
One of the narratives was, the Indian restaurants can't get curry chefs. You can't import somebody from India to work as a chef. And this is destroying this whole part of our local culture. Vote for Brexit and we'll have lots of curry chefs, right? It's a lie. It's an absolute lie. They had no intention of opening up wider migration from the old Commonwealth countries. But it was a very powerful argument, I think, for a lot of those people. Just very briefly to say, one of the issues here is that actually the most British people in Britain are the minority ethnic communities, right? Why? Because they don't feel English. I mean, particularly if it's an English nationalist kind of representation of that. But they feel entitled to be British because of the whole old imperial history and everything else. And I think it's a tragedy for those communities, actually. It's a particular tragedy for them, which is that this other Britishness, this kind of capacious, open Britishness that could contain all of these different kinds of identities as a multinational community, Britishness, as Anthony Barnes says, has become Brexitness. And I think there may be no way back for that. It's very hard to see how an open, progressive Britishness will survive this process. So they're going to have to find a way of being English and Scottish and Welsh, which allows that greater sense of belonging.
And on the final point about what a colossal waste of time.
Oh, yeah. So the book is not a book about process, right? So if you're going to write about a book about Brexit, the one smart thing you do is you don't write about the process at all, because it'll be out of date by the time the book comes out. So it's really very much about trying to look at these deeper questions. But when I was doing a last chapter or addendum for the American edition, which is just coming out, I did decide to write about time and about this kind of very weird sense of time with Brexit, which is that, Donald Tusk said there was a special place in hell for those who had driven Brexit without having a plan. I think it's actually a special place in time, or the hellish nature is that time seems both to slow down and to speed up, right? So you have all this sort of stuff, history hurtling towards you, and at the same time, they've behaved as if there was all the time in the world.
And Barnier's clock ticking.
Yeah, the clock ticking. Yeah. But, where did we end up? What's the thing that gave us if it is the final solution for the withdrawal agreement, where we were in the first week of December 2017, the Northern Ireland only backstop, So it's had this kind of weird, meandering, circular sense of time. And you're absolutely right about the absolute, utter waste. It's a displacement activity. It's not going to address the misery in people's lives. It's not going to address the vast challenges of climate change, the vast challenges of a post-industrial society. The real questions that people desperately need their governments to be addressing for them are being displaced. I mean, in a way, it's a brilliant piece of magic performed by what I would think of as a decadent ruling class, which no longer has any answers to any of those questions. And what it did was, brilliantly, it recognized the popular anger. It drew a big target on a brick wall and said, kick here. And there's great satisfaction in kicking the wall, but also you break your foot. It doesn't do you any good. And of course, the problems are not going away simply because they're being ignored. They're festering. Whoever the government is in Britain, they're going to have to face up to, what does a post-Brexit landscape look like? And what it looks like is there is no post-Brexit landscape. Brexit will never be over. It's a 100-year effect. I mean, the term has been coined, Brexternity. And I'm afraid that's the hell that people are going to be stuck in.
You've just ruined everybody's
I know.
evening. And on that happy note, I was going to say thank you very much, Fintan. I think it's been an absolute treat for the audience to have you here, and the range of questions has been fantastic also. There is a drink outside afterwards, and Fintan will also be around and signing books, and there are copies available so that you can buy them and get them signed if that's what you'd like to do. But please join me in a huge round of applause. So thank you very much. And we wish you all the best for your gladiatorial contest on Have I Got News For You. I look forward to seeing it on Friday. Thank you all. Drinks are outside.